You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your co-hosts, Eugene Perrier, as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
Great to be back on with you, Eugene.
Yes, well, it's great for both of us then. We had a few technical difficulties, so we're starting a little late, so I want to get into it relatively quickly, but just to remind people who are watching on YouTube to hit that subscribe button so that you're subscribed to our channel, and hit the bell so you can get the alerts about the channel you just subscribed to and all the fantastic stuff we are putting out on a regular basis, including dispatches with Rania Khalek. So many other good things that are happening as well. But nevertheless, you are able to do that. Don't forget that just below our faces on the screen, there are various buttons by which you can donate, and we'd be more than grateful for all of your donations. And of course, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news if you want to become an ongoing donor. So that's where it is. We got a lot for you here on the show, and I think we can turn to our first story now, which is something about the Ukraine that perhaps you've never heard, political prisoners, and what that really means about the broader conflict and how it's presented to us. And we are very honored to be joined for this topic by Mayuk Biswas, who is the General Secretary of the Students' Federation of India. Mayuk, thank you so much for being with us. Well, oh, sorry, can you hear us?
I think his volume's really low, obviously. Pointing out the obvious. You're welcome.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes. Now it's
there
better.
We go.
We can hear
Perfect.
you now. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being willing to join. And your organization, Students Federation of India, is a member of the World Federation of Democratic Youth that, starting tomorrow, is going to be waging a worldwide campaign for the freedom of the Kananovich brothers in Ukraine, communists in Ukraine, political prisoners. I want to get into some of the implications of that, but I think very few people around the world have heard of this case of the Kananovich brothers. So if you could just briefly give us a sense of what happened with these two gentlemen.
Well, what we can say is the perfect war to the West, which is actually it was a West war. It's one on Russia. At the same time, it's a war on ideology. What it means is that it's not about that Ukraine versus Russia. Ukraine is just at the theater, what we can say. At the same time, what we can say is that these people actually they're targeted because they were known to such an ideology. Actually, from very long in a country like India, we used to read books like How the Steel Was Tempered by Nikolai Ostrovsky, which is from Ukraine. At the same time, we read the book like Mother, just like this Maxim Gorky. This is very young, but at the same time, it's a war. The war, the way is West. It was so much money, and they just want to destroy all progressive elements of the Soviet culture.
Mayuk, give us 1 second here. I think we're having a little trouble hearing you on our end. I want to just see if we can figure it out. I think it might be the volume.
Yeah, I think something's wrong with the audio. Let's see if we can get that figured out.
We'll see if we can get this fixed.
The story he's talking about is so important. It's gotten almost no attention, if any at all, in the Western press, or maybe even in the international press, which is the persecution of leftists in Ukraine, which is happening under a government that is also has like integrated in its armed forces neo-Nazis.
There's so many things. They've banned strikes, by the way. In the whole country. I don't know why you shouldn't be allowed to strike necessarily, but I guess they say it's a war measure. And they've banned basically every single media outlet that was not already controlled by the government. And I think they've just merged them into one media outlet. They've banned all of the opposition political parties, more or less, that were not rabidly pro-war. And certainly the largest opposition party, the Platform for Life, I think is the name of it. So, I mean, it speaks very much to kind of this hidden side, Rania, that you're not allowed to discuss, like anything bad about Ukraine, no matter how factual, actually. You're not allowed to talk about it because somehow that's, traitorous.
Pro-Putin.
Yes.
It's pro-Putin, pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine. You're being a dictator apologist. I mean, the fact that Ukraine was like it was considered the most corrupt country, was ranked the most corrupt country in Europe before this war by like Freedom House, which isn't exactly a pro-Russia outfit.
No, for sure.
It's like
if anyone was going to fudge.
Yeah, it would be Freedom House.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And, the final steps of the total liberalization of land in Ukraine. They've been going on for several years, but it actually was something that I was thinking about earlier this year, right before the grain deal, or maybe a couple months before the grain deal, because there was maybe Reuters, I forget exactly where it was, an article about farmers in Ukraine or whatever, and whether or not they were going to be able to harvest the crop, whether or not they were planting a crop for a fall harvest, all these different things. But the guy they were quoting, the farmer, was a Dutch guy. And, who owned these farms in Ukraine. And the article itself was very interesting on a range of points, but I do think that it's one of the elements of this, the deep sort of neoliberalization of the economy that's been a big part of this push since the potential EU partnership agreement in 2014, accept the IMF deal, privatize all the land and open it up to international agribusiness, erode the labor laws, challenge and start to ban communist parties and other leftist parties that stood up against those kind of measures in the parliament. And obviously they were, had a presence in the Ukrainian parliament, just like they do in many former Soviet countries. So, I mean, that's really sort of a hidden history, perhaps, of this quote-unquote Ukraine. Should they go to the east? Should they go to the west? Is that sort of going to the quote-unquote west also means, turning yourself into like a laboratory for crazy free market ideas?
No, I mean, that's exactly what's happening right now at the advice of the European Union and European leaders in general, who are having huge sway over the sorts of like labor policies that are being enacted in Ukraine. And like you mentioned, I mean, have been since 2014. It's completely anti-left. And I think it's important, especially for the people on the Western left, to understand what's going on, because especially European left. I mean, the European left has really been folded into the sort of like pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-Cold War mentality. And that it's like very difficult to find any opposition to that now. So it's really important for people to recognize these things. Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
we're still working on this on the back end. The audience
we are, but I think we may have to come back to the Ukraine story and just move forward here. It's an important story. We'll try to bring it back, and we really appreciate Mayuk being willing to join us from India. It's very, very late there, earlier, one of the two. So we'll figure that out. But we wanted to move to another very important story, another story that's flying under the radar, and that's the ongoing sanctions. I think this is 25 years. I could be wrong. Our guest will tell us, against the country of Zimbabwe. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Rutendo Matnyare, who is the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement and the founder of Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War Sanctions. Rutendo, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, you might be muted.
Wow, the technological
can't hear
gremlins are getting us today.
Thank you for remembering my gremlins thing, Rania.
Yeah. Man, it's like it's one of those days, when we started the show.
What do they call it? Murphy's Law?
Yeah, it's like
when anything can go wrong.
We have a great lineup, but technology is like not working with us today. We were supposed to start at the top of the hour, but we had
I already went with Murphy's Law, but there's also Occam's razor. The simplest answer must be the right one. So perhaps we're being interfered with by forces who don't want us to hear about these important stories.
Someone's testing us. Yeah, someone's testing us.
Hey, look, political prisoners in Ukraine, sanctions on Zimbabwe. A lot of powerful people don't want you to hear about that.
What else are we supposed to think? Okay. So I think.
Okay, I think we have Rutindo back here.
I think we have him back on.
Can you hear us?
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for being willing to join us. And I wanted to start here because, I think for people in the United States, everything they've probably heard in the past couple of weeks about sanctions in Zimbabwe are just these statements from the U.S. government that, the sanctions they do nothing at all. So if you could talk about what these sanctions actually are and the effect they've had on Zimbabwe.
Oh, no.
Oh, did he freeze?
I think so. I mean.
This is.
Wow, this is like unprecedented. This is unprecedented.
Well, you may actually remember, Rania, when we came back from Ethiopia last year, like I think it was our first show back, there was a bunch of tech difficulties and we thought maybe the TPLF was trying to stop us. Well, let me just ask you this.
Thought, not past tense, I still think. But anyways.
Not past tense. You're probably right. Listen, sleeper cells. And obviously, well, we'll see later in the show, we do want to come back around to the issue of Ethiopia, but I have been thinking a lot about our trip, obviously, Rania, since this peace deal has been signed. And you think about things that have been censored by YouTube. You had an excellent segment. It was obviously, difficult for us to do. It was powerful, talking to women who'd been sexually assaulted by the TPLF, and it was suppressed as far as we could tell by YouTube.
Oh,
I mean, you never know, but I mean, no video we've ever done on Ethiopia or anything related to the Horn has had that low of views, and it was like amazing to see that this powerful story was being, pushed down by these internet giants.
Yeah, and of course we'll never know because these algorithms are secret and you don't know like who's deciding what content is being we know for a fact that certain content is boosted. We know that CNN and the Daily Show is boosted, and you know how I know is because they're constantly being boosted into my feed. Wait, I'm hearing he's back.
I think we might third time's the charm here. Okay, there we go. We can hear you. I feel confident. I don't know if you heard my question, but I was just asking as the first question if you could just explain, what sanctions are on Zimbabwe and what's the effect that they're having?
Well, thank you so much. First of all, we've got congressional sanctions on Zimbabwe. The congressional sanctions are tailored to ensure that Zimbabwe cannot get loans from multilateral lending institution. More importantly, cannot get cancellation of debt. And why this is so important is the fact that when we got our independence after fighting a protracted war for 17 years, we had what was called the Lancaster House Conference. What that was essentially was the British forcing the liberation fighters into a negotiation process so that they would not defeat the settlers that were settled on the land who were being defeated in the war. So the British government, the American government, they jump in. That's after they had been sponsoring 15,000 mercenaries to actually stop the independence of Zimbabwe. So we negotiate this independence negotiation. It says we can't take land for the first 10 years, but more critically, it says that we will not pay reparations, but we will give you ability to borrow money from multilateral lending institutions to rebuild, reconstruct the country from the colonization, from the exploitation. And if you use your own money to rebuild the country, then you can actually get cancellation of debt after a certain period of time. So as you would know, Zimbabwe created the best education system in Africa over a 20-year period. We had to build 5,700 schools. But within that period, we spent so much money that we actually had to go through a structural adjustment program. So now when we get to about 1999, 2000, we start wanting to get debt cancellation because the debt was just a bit too much. And what actually caused Zimbabwe's debt to actually grow out of proportion was the fact that we had to fight a war against apartheid South Africa, who were sabotaging Zimbabwe, sabotaging the entire SADC region in order for apartheid to remain. And that's where we took about 60% of our current debt. Now, Zidera comes in, Congress says, we can't get cancellation of debts. We can't get new debts to build new schools. And immediately this puts Zimbabwe in a debt trap. And we're still in that debt trap now. These sanctions were supposed to ensure that Mugabe does not get elected again in 2002 elections. Zimbabweans re-elected him because he was undertaking land reform. He was giving land back to Zimbabweans. And so the United States President, George Bush, decided that this time he was actually going to institute what are called executive order sanctions on Zimbabweans. these executive order sanctions were tailored now to cripple industry, to cripple the manufacturing, to cripple the farming, and to ensure that we do not get loans. Our banks cannot lend those people that were undertaking land reform, and the new farmers on the land could not get with the government of Zimbabwe. So they were actually comprehensive sanctions. They called them targeted sanctions, but as you can hear, those are not targeted. They're on the government of Zimbabwe. And we are the people that then went to the government to say, you've got to go to the UN, get the UN involved, get the UN to declare these sanctions illegal and to also declare them violations against humanity. But we actually feel that they're crimes against humanity because they persecute the Zimbabwean people. And I think Rainer has spoken about this enough times that people know what it is that happens with sanctions. They are weapons, and they are weapons that are found to be illegal by the Geneva Convention.
You know, I wanted to ask, before we kind of continue with the topic of sanctions, you mentioned the issue that drove the U.S. under Bush to declare these kinds of sanctions was the issue of land reform. Can you expand a little bit on what you mean by land reform in Zimbabwe, and what did that land reform do in improving the quality of life of people who live there?
Thank you so much. So when we went for this 17-year war from 1963 over to 1980, when we get our independence, and then we're forced to have these negotiations on how it is that power was going to be transferred, we were actually fighting, or our liberation fighters were fighting for land. They were fighting for land, one man, one vote, and the right to actually participate in the economy equally, and the right to be educated and to get good jobs. So we get our independence. The independence agreement obviously is very influenced by the British, the Americans, the Europeans. I like to call them the Berlin Conference cabal, the same people that colonized us, same people that created the 1454 law of discovery. They colonized all non-white countries. And so they're the same people that sat to be able to decide on how it is that we get our independence. So as a compromise, the Zimbabweans, there were UN sanctions on Rhodesia. And I always say that the UN sanctions on Rhodesia were proposed by the British and the Americans to ensure the deindustrialization of this country called Rhodesia, or the colonial country, so that when the new country comes in, is deindustrialized, cannot produce its own oil, cannot process its own petroleum products, so that it would be forced to negotiate and to be dependent on the Western countries for oil, for US dollars, for loans, and everything else. That's also why they didn't pay reparations. So part of the agreement was the white farmers, or the settler farmers, would remain with their land. The land would not be immediately returned to black Zimbabweans. And then the government of Zimbabwe would buy land from white farmers in what was called willing buyer, willing seller. In this willing buyer, willing seller, the Zimbabwean government would have to buy the land in foreign currency. The land would have to be valued by real estate agencies that belonged to the very same settlers. So the land would always be expensive. And then 50% of the money after the government has paid its 50% would come from the European powers, who would then top up. So land was expensive. We could not resettle all the people we wanted. So 3 million hectares is taken in the first 10 years. Those 3 million hectares are sent through to 71,000 families. Now, each family would be on average 8 people to 10 people. Then the government had reached in this agreement that was called the Lancaster Agreement, an agreement to say, once we get to 10 years, the moratorium is over. You can now take land by creating laws in the new constitution that determines how you take your land. So the Zimbabwean government says, we're now going to take land. They create a new Land Appropriation Act. And in this Land Appropriation Act, they now say that government would value the land. They would then give letters to the farmers and then pay them in local currency. The British were not happy. The Americans were not happy because they didn't want the land to return to the Zimbabwean people. What they wanted is a broke government that could not afford that land, that would then be begging for money from the Europeans, who would then deny them the money. So there were negotiations from 1990, when this new law was created, all the way to 1997. Tony Blair comes in. Tony Blair says, listen here, I'm not the government that made this agreement with you. My government has no obligation to give you land, so we are not going to give you back the land. Mugabe said, that's fine. The land was always ours. We were going to take it, but we were going to require you to pay your settlers, your children. But now that you've decided that you're not going to pay them, we are going to take land and give it back to our people. And so within that period, there was a negotiation process, what was called the Land Conference, held in Harare, to try and see if the donors in the Western world could find a settlement or an agreement. But Mugabe was saying you can't renegotiate the terms of the Lancaster House Conference that saw us suffering for 10 years, unable to take land for 10 years, and now you want to change the rules and create a new agreement. If you can't honor this one, what would make you honor a new one? And another thing that you need to note, South Africa was negotiating its independence between 1989 and 1994. So the South Africans asked Mugabe to say, please, stop taking land, stop appropriating this land that belongs to black people, because then this might make the South African settlers, the apartheid government, not want to negotiate. So Mugabe held out for about 6 years for South Africa to get independence and to write its constitution, after which then he decided to negotiate with the Blair government about taking back land. Of course, the Blair government refused. And immediately, what many people don't understand is Mugabe didn't necessarily make a policy to say, let's start taking land. The war veterans, the people that had gone to war, had waited for 17 years, were just tired. And they decided, we're not waiting anymore. We're going to invade the land. And if you send soldiers or police to take us off our land, then we're going to go to war with our government. And this was not going to work with the government. So he decided to let those people take the land. Now, what has been the benefit? The benefit has been that we have seen black people, black farmers, growing up the experience curve, doing it without money, learning how to farm, and now they're producing more tobacco than they've ever produced before. Not that I support the growing of commercial crops, but they have learned how to farm. They're producing this year more wheat than we've ever produced before, that we've actually got a surplus of about 60,000 tons. And we're going to be exporting some of that wheat. We've also had surpluses in maize. And even though there's negative publicity in the media, which I believe propaganda goes hand in hand with the fight that we're undertaking, as you were saying about the Ukraine scenario, is that we're seeing young black farmers, young black millionaires, young millionaires that are found in fuel, telecommunications, agriculture. And agriculture is the driver of the entire economy. So there are definitely lots of benefits. The Americans are not happy with that, hence the sanctions. And they're trying to tighten these sanctions in many ways. But Zimbabwe has had one advantage. We've had an educated human capital that has gone all over the world. So while they close up our industry, we have many remittances that are being remitted back to Zimbabwe, reinvested into the economy, particularly agriculture and mining, and also other indigenous areas of business like tourism, construction. And hence we're having quite a boom in Zimbabwe, and it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world at the moment, under sanctions, and the Americans are not happy about that.
Well, I can certainly see why they might not be happy bucking their agenda, but no, I really appreciate that context, which is crucial. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the late Sam Moyo did fantastic work on revealing some of the successes of land reform. But one of the things I want to also ask you about is it feels like there is, at least certainly in the African continent, a lot of momentum around the idea of lifting the sanctions. Certainly, we had the anti-sanctions day of the SADC countries last week. I believe you all are taking some action in court. So talk a little bit about this, because it does feel that there's something of a groundswell coming out, at least the southern half of the continent, around really making something happen on this issue.
Yes, there's a lot that is happening, and we're proud to say that we were central to the writing and the drafting of the new strategy that is being utilized by the government. We had realized that Venezuela played a very strategic role in reversing the sentiment that was beginning to grow when the Americans were trying to invade Venezuela. As the people were united, they became united, they began to speak with one voice. And I have to say, Ms. Kalak was very, very instrumental in that revolution. And what that did is it taught us that we need to unite our people too. We need to start demystifying sanctions, understanding sanctions, telling our people about sanctions, and telling our neighbors so that we get solidarity. And once we get solidarity, one of the central tenets that we were telling our government is you need to go multilateral. You've got to go back to the UN. You've got to go to the World Trade Organization, because the rules in these institutions were created by the very same Americans and the West who are not following these world rules, these international rules, yet they're the ones that wrote these rules and forced African countries to follow them. So we need to hold them accountable to the same laws that they created. And so in 2001, what they wanted to do is the pressure of sanctions was already building. So their intention was to remove sanctions and then to blacklist Zimbabwe through the Financial Action Task Force for money laundering. And the reason they'll do that is they know that once they block normal channels of finance. You have to use alternative channels. And within using those alternative channels, they are then going to flag you for money laundering and so-called financing of terrorism. And so what we did is when we were grey listed, we wrote a document to the Minister of Justice explaining to the Minister of Justice that the strategy was to remove sanctions because they were beginning to show that the West and the Americans were breaking international law, but then they would use these anti-money laundering laws, which are equally unjust because they do not come with due process. They just say a nation is breaking money laundering laws, and then they blacklist that nation, take it away from the financial system without any trials and without any due process. So we warned our Minister of Justice that this was what was going to happen. So this multi-pronged strategy, talking to the Zimbabwean people, talking to the neighbors and leaders within the region, talking to the AU, going to the UN, all coalesced to start creating a question on the legality of sanctions. And so now the UN came in, they did an impact assessment, they realized that there was no impact assessment done by the Americans over 21 years. That's a violation of even sanctions imposed by the UN. More importantly, they realized that these sanctions were unilateral. They didn't involve the UN. There was no due process. No one was tried, but people were just punished collectively without trial, which is a violation of the human rights, Bill of Rights. And so we began to press to say, if the UN has given us these weapons, we now need to go into the courts and test this in the courts. So our biggest trading partner is South Africa. And so that means that all transactions, majority of our transactions, majority of our banking, majority of our international trade is done with South Africa. And South African banks were implementing illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe. Now, the UN Human Rights Council has got a resolution called 3413. It says that the implementation of sanctions is illegal. More importantly, you implementing sanctions on behalf, as a third party, on behalf of sanctions sender is also illegal. So we decided that we are going to go after the South African banks that are denying Zimbabweans accounts, loans, corresponding banking relationships, or transfer of US dollar notes to Zimbabwe, and they're doing it without trial. So that is against the South African constitution that does not allow punishment without trial. And we believe that if we get a ruling from this, if we get a declaratory order that stops South African banks from doing this, that ruling is going to touch on software companies, going to touch on machinery manufacturers, tool manufacturers, any other company in South Africa from implementing the sanctions. But here's where the magic is. The South African constitution is considered one of the best in the world. And it's done so deliberately by the United States because they use South Africa as their launchpad into Africa to control Africa. So we say if their outpost can say that these sanctions are illegal, then every other country in the world that respects the South African constitution, that utilizes it as a springboard into controlling Africa, will have to do the same. So that means the Americans themselves, their banks, have got to accept the same ruling. And the ruling is expected to be in our favor because we've already got a bank called CBZ. CBZ broke US sanctions 15,500 times. They refused to impose sanctions. They took the sanctions list and all people on the sanctions list, they gave them bank accounts and allowed them to transact. The Americans were not happy. So they penalized CBZ, $380 million US. CBZ went, got one of the biggest law firms in the world and decided to resist this penalty. The United States was unable to convince CBZ to pay this penalty because their sanctions are illegal, they're unenforceable. So they had to cancel their penalty, so to speak. That's another international precedent. And that international precedence, together with our international precedents, gives us weapons to go to the international community, particularly businesses, and say, listen, you cannot impose sanctions or enforce sanctions on Zimbabwe or implement sanctions on Zimbabwe because the rulings say the sanctions are illegal, they are unenforceable, so it's illegal for you to enforce the same sanctions. If they refuse to take heed, then we can go for damages. We can penalize them for damages. We can penalize them for continuing to exert an illegality upon the Zimbabwean people without trial, without court orders.
Wow. Well, this is a critical front, and I think the worldwide struggle against sanctions, and very, very interesting. We will continue to watch this and keep updated on it. Rutindo Matinyare from the Zimbabwe anti-sanctions movement. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show and helping illuminate some of this.
Thank you so much, and I want to say thank you for you guys. You've been fighting this anti-sanctions fight. You've made it a worldwide issue. You've shown the illegality. You've shown the fact that it's a weapon of hegemony. And I'd like to thank you for the work that you guys have done. We wouldn't be here without guys like you. You've made it an international movement, and I appreciate it so much.
Right on. Thank you, brother. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
And we will continue to touch on this issue. I think it's a crucial issue, and I think everything that was laid out there by Rutindo is critical. I mean, the punishment of Zimbabwe for deciding to have its own sovereignty, and even despite all that, I have to say, when countries all around Africa are looking for teachers, they always go to Zimbabwe because of the work he mentioned there that's been done on education. So Zimbabwe anti-sanctions movement, Rutindo Manyare, he's very also active on social media, so you can find their work easily, but we will, of course, continue to track that story. Want to quickly shout out a few people here. We've got Martine Hernandez.
Love
just
Martine.
Loyal, very loyal. Donating,
Very
shout out to
loyal.
you. Got a couple anonymous pounds and Norwegian krona. That's good. Aaron Blaine, shout out to you. And Excomers also with some Norwegian krona. Very strong showing from Norway on this show. I like that. Up north.
Yeah.
Arctic Circle. Okay, that's the northern part of the country, but shout out to Norway. Well, another story that we've been tracking quite a bit, obviously, is what's going on in Brazil and the wake of the election where President Lula, or President-elect Lula, was able to come in, and there's quite a bit happening on the streets. So rather than editorialize, I will bring in our next guest, who's Ana Júlia Guedes, who's a lawyer and a militant with Levante Popular. Ana, thank you so much for being back with us.
Are you listening to me fine?
We are. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes, I'm listening too.
Perfect. Well, if you could, maybe just give us a sense of what the scene is there in Brazil. I mean, we're seeing a lot of these blockades and other things in the news. I mean, where do things stand a few days after the election?
Well, first, let me say thank you for inviting me again. I hope anytime soon I can be invited to say something great that is happening in Brazil and not how Bolsonaro is destroying the country again. But anyways, what we're seeing right now all over the country are a few blockades on the highways and some protests in front of army units asking for a federal intervention in a country that has suffered 21 years of a military dictatorship on the last century. But although it is quite shocking, the scenes are unbelievable and the demandings are unbelievable. It is not unexpected considering what Bolsonaro has been saying for the last 4 years as a president. He's been saying that for the last 28 years of public life that he has. But for the last 4 years, he has been saying that the electoral system does not work. We should not trust the Ministry of Justice or the Supreme Court. We should not trust the voting. We should not trust the television. We should not trust the news. And that had, after all that had become this chaos, this chaotic situation where some of his supporters are blocking highways and creating a chaos, especially on the food system. In a country where we have 33 million people in a hunger situation, we are now having a problem of like 600,000 liters of milk that can be wasted per day with these blockades. But we have seen it's not as big as it was on Sunday or Monday. Now it is smaller. There is the support is diminishing as he pronounces through the week. He took 2 days to be alive again after the election. He took 2 days to show up. Made a very confusing and generic discourse. But now earlier today, he has asked to his supporters to leave the highways, to let the people pass, to let the economy go on. He took 4 days in a country with all this chaotic situation we already are in terms of industry and economic, but he took 4 days to finally ask the people to leave. And now people are actually leaving some parts, but that does not mean they have stopped going to, especially the army units, to ask for the federal intervention, which is completely lunatic. It is completely lunatic. Um, Here, us as a popular movement, we're keeping our eye on it. We're trying to keep to see where it is. Is it growing as big as out of the regions where he had the biggest votations? But for now, it is still big where Bolsonaro won the elections. There are three regions in the country. But which is also contradictory, because if you think where he has big supporters, and they're making bigger blockades, and they're making bigger damages on their own economies. So it's quite what Bolsonaro politics and supporting is. It's quite it sounds unpolitical, but it is political in that way. And I think that's how it resembles a lot from Trump. That is something, it's a terrible parallel that can be made, but it resembles a lot because it is this denial of politics, this denial of economy, that actually makes the basis of the ideology. And but there's something very important here that I want to remark before we go on this call out. These protests are being called not through the traditional way they use it to do. They use it to go to their own Facebook and their own Twitter and their own Instagrams to say, like, the Jair Bolsonaro, the father and now ex-president, but his son, the senator, and the deputy, and everybody, they would go to their own social media to say that is not happening right now. His sons, the Flavio and Carlos Bolsonaro, are on Twitter supporting these protests that are happening in front of the army units, but are not supporting these ones that are going on the highways, which does not mean they do not support it or called it out. But the main way that these things are being called are through WhatsApp and Instagram, which is something that is happening in many other countries. That is this way to create an anonymous call out to these protests that provoke chaos and that are right wing. And here is it's coming back because through the past period he had more, as he was the president and the senator and everything, and his sons were. He thought he could go to the social media and put his own face to say that these kind of creating chaos is supported. But as we grew on force, as we could demonstrate that he yes has an opposition on society, he now went back to the shadows that elected him. After all, that is Telegram and WhatsApp and this anonymous and insidious way to make politics. It's quite there's many things. We had many crazy. It's I don't know. In a way, we think it's sad, but not surprising, because we had even in one of our states here, Santa Catarina, that is on the south region. We had a video of a massive protest going on, and they made the Nazi the salutation to sing the national anthem. That is completely out of sense. That is completely and unacceptable. But yet we do not have, although we are trying the Workers' Party, that is Lula's party, it is already going on the justice, asking for the law ways to get it done. But for now, we're still quite state is yet quite shy in retaining all that is happening, because yet the national director of the police, it is still a man indicated by Bolsonaro. The national director of all other police forces on the states are still elected by Bolsonaro supporters that are on the governors, the state governors. So it is yet quite slow institutional response to this, under the argument that is legal and constitutional to make these kind of protests because it's freedom of speech, which is unacceptable because we also have on the Constitution saying that it is forbidden to make any sort of Nazi and fascist signs, but it is still being maintained. So it's the collapse of the Bolsonaro government. It is being as dirty and bloody uh, and slow as we thought it would be, and as we expected it will happen on the future, because we do know that this electoral victory is only the first step on towards to actually changing the political scenario in Brazil now.
I'm curious, how important is it that the U.S. Basically noted or said to Brazil, said to Bolsonaro, respect the election results and let this be?
You see, it is I don't want to make any offense, but it's sadly terribly important. It is really important that finalization that the U.S. Senate made was extremely important because, as Latin Americans, we know what happens when the U.S. government decides to elect some of our presidents, and in this case, when this finalization it also demonstrated to his supporters that the international support that he says that he has, because that is a very important thing, as he directs his supporters not to trust on television, not to trust on newspaper, not to trust on any radio, only to trust their own communication channels that are on Telegram, on WhatsApp, that we cannot have a really quick response to it. It is hard to demonstrate that he does not have international support as he say he has. So when the Senate votes that if he and Joe Biden also endorses that he will not support any attempt of coup in Brazil, that creates a momentum of doubt in between the supporters, because maybe something is wrong, maybe something is not as he say it is, and also because at the end, Lula was the most voted man in the history of Brazil. He had 60 million votes. No one ever had that. So, although there are 58 million that voted for Bolsonaro, in the end, the day is going on, our days is going on, the week is going on normally. Most of the country, it is normally going on with some shortages happening in some places, but think the day is going, the week is going, and that also contributes to create the idea that no, Bolsonaro does not own the reason and the truth and the last word about everything that is happening around the world and around the country.
I think it's very important context, and I appreciate it, and to some degree it feels that the Bolsonaro supporters are afraid of change, really, as you're pointing out, because Lula is coming in now. So I was hoping you could also talk about that. I mean, what are some of the things that, popular movements are hoping to see, in the early stages of this Lula administration?
Well, you see, for us who are actually organizing the resistance on in these last 6 years since the national coup in 2016 against Dilma, we are filled with hope and filled with ideas once again. So instead of taking these protests for as an example, we are looking closely to it. We're making meetings regularly, but we are still expecting, because we know that what is to come, it is to come. We have big expectations on terms of coming back the growth in the industry. We had a huge deindustrialization in Brazil in these last 4 years that got us to almost being totally agrarian again, which is a shame because we have one of the biggest national enterprises of oil, that is Petrobras. We have also the expectation of a larger integration with Latin America and the BRICS, which is extremely important, and it can change the entire scenario of international and the world economy. So, and we know that all the governments that Lula and Dilma made, they had this very special attention and strategic way to look to international relations. So we have that large expectation onto it, and it is going to be quite interesting to look, considering what stage is BRICS now and what stage is Latin America now, with progressist governments all over, from Mexico now down to Argentina. We're all united in a very close objective of making a new history. We also have the expectations on education and health. We have a universal health system that is an example to the entire world. That is the SUS, and we have the expectation that it goes back. It has the structure to gain space very quickly, because it already had. It was just thrown away by the government. But that we have a very big expectation, and that on the education we also have a big public education structure all over the country, and we have to make some changes, including in the content, because one of the things that the other government did, Michel Temer, was to change the educational content to make it more to make it worse, to make it more superficial, to make it more loose, especially on the social sciences part. So we have the expectation that changes, including in the important ideology battle we have through the for the next years. So that is also something big we have. And but all that, we're still aware that all that will have many obstacles, especially on the Congress, because although Bolsonaro's party it's right wing, but it's quite loose. We would call it here from the center, although the center that is always on the government. His party actually has historically been that, and the other biggest parties also. But there's going to be some favor exchanges, and we don't know yet where it goes. But we know that this education, it will be a big battle to assume. Health will be a big battle. International relations, and definitely environmental. I think that will be something that it's going to be much different from the other governments, because we not only the government and the Workers' Party, but also we as left did not have the dimension of how the environmental matter it is important to Brazil and is structural. So, and we have a very important figure today. That I think I've heard that she's going to be the representative of the country of the government to come on the COP27. That is Marina Silva, and she's a very central figure here on the defense of the Amazonian rainforest, but the entire Brazilian ecosystem. So, as she's part again of the government, I think that will be important steps to move toward that. And I think we have big expectations, big dreams, and big hopes. And we're also trying to make these big expectations and hopes and fears and etc. but into popular organization, because we are definitely aware that we cannot count on the Congress, and we cannot count on only on the composition of the government to make it work. But I think that for us that survived through the coup to now, we have energy, and we took a few days to rest, as one of our leaders said, that it is time to rest. It is time to make some party, because it's been 6 long years of fighting the president. But now we have these expectations to believe. We believe that it is now the result of the elections also demonstrated that the Brazilian population, it is more tended to vote and to support a definite, the very well defined political agenda, that some of that central thing, because it voted for Bolsonaro and for Lula, voted for two very different projects. So this is a moment where these contradictions of these class contradictions and the class struggle is quite open in the country, and we have to take this moment in order to actually inject some of the structural changes that affects many of the conservative economy and the conservative sectors of politics.
Well, Ana Júlia Guedes from Levante Popular, we look forward to talking to you more about your hopes and dreams of the popular movement coming to
Yes.
fruition in Brazil. And we really thank you for giving us some of your time here today on the Freedom
Thank
Side.
you very much. I hope the next time we meet, I bring some great news about something great that is happening, some great summits made in Latin America with Brazil on center, and not only about how this man could manage to destroy this amazing and enormous country in so little time.
Yes, that's right. Onward and upward we go. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, Rania, let's keep the movement moving on here. I want to quickly shout out Rich for your donation, an anonymous donation as well, $20. Thank you. And Gio, shout out to you as well for your donation. Now we want to move to our next story, which is the Horn of Africa, where a permanent cessation of hostilities was signed yesterday between the government of Ethiopia, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, one day before, of course, today, which is the anniversary of the launching of the TPLF war on November 3rd of 2020. So a lot happening here on that anniversary, and we are very happy to be joined yet again here on the show. She hasn't gotten sick of us yet. Hermela Aregawi, who is a Ethiopian-American journalist with Eye on Africa News and also with the No More movement. Hermela, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Listen, if you're not sick of me, I'm not sick of you.
Well, that's very good to hear. We are definitely not sick of you, and I don't think anyone watching is either. Now, I think for a lot of people, ourselves included, Hermela, we were on yesterday, people have probably, some people have seen what's happening in terms of this quote unquote peace deal. But maybe for those who just have not seen much beyond maybe that something happened, if you could just give a capsule view of, what was agreed to in South Africa yesterday after 10 days of mediation.
Yes, yesterday was a historic day in South Africa after 10 days of negotiations between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, a rebel group that started this war to the day 2 years ago. And what they signed is essentially a peace deal. In it, the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, has agreed to disarm, demobilize, and help reintegrate TPLF combatants into Ethiopian society with security considerations. And the timeline for that starts now. 24 hours later, the commanders and leaders on both sides are supposed to be speaking with each other to talk about the process of how to do this. And then within 30 days, the Tigray People's Liberation Front is going to be completely disarmed per this agreement. Per this agreement, the National Defense Forces of Ethiopia will be the only armed defense forces of the country. And then a couple of other points that I think are worth mentioning, although that would maybe be the biggest point, is that the Tigray People's Liberation Front has agreed not to aid and abet other armed groups in the country, which was suspected that they were doing that with the Oromo Liberation Association that operates largely outside of Tigray. And then they've also agreed, signed on the dotted line, that they will not work with foreign powers against Ethiopia's sovereignty. Again, to me, an admission of something that we all suspected that they were doing in order to push forward their regime change plan. So it's a hopeful moment. And, as skeptical as I am about how smoothly this will go, there's a lot of people I'm talking to, including in government, who say they really don't have that much on the ground at this point. As we saw, the military, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, did make a lot of advancements in the last 10 or so days. So what it looks like to me, although I always leave room for more information, is that the Ethiopian government has essentially won this war militarily, and the negotiations in South Africa was terms of how to finalize it, which is how they were able to get the TPLF leadership to sign something this big. I don't believe that they would have signed it if they felt like they had some military capacity to be able to move forward. And also, it's just to save their own butts. This leadership, if they stayed in Tigray as the National Defense Forces were moving into the capital of that region, Mekelle, chances are they may have ended up dead like some of their predecessors, the CU Mesfin and two other main leaders of TPLF who early on in this war were shot and killed while they were hiding out in caves and allegedly refused to surrender. So they knew possibly that was their fate. So what it looks like is they were trying to save themselves. And ultimately, I'll give them credit, they are going to save a lot more lives if this deal goes through as signed.
Oh, Rania, you're muted.
This
Sorry
happened
about
with
that.
Eugene last time. That's
No,
so
you know
funny.
what is I just sabotaged myself. I was like, oh no, okay. That's an important point is, okay, so let's say this deal actually does go through. What are the chances of it sticking? I mean, at this point, it seems like the TPLF was forced into this by the realities on the ground, which is that they were losing badly and really had no other way to like save face. So how is the after 2 years, I guess I imagine people are asking this question probably inside Ethiopia, after 2 years of war, after several ceasefires broken by the TPLF, and ongoing offensives, after all of the aid that's been stolen and the atrocities committed. Of course, as a war, I'm sure atrocities have been committed on all sides. But how is the, I guess, government supposed to trust that the TPLF will abide by this? Because in the past, whenever they've asked for a ceasefire or agreed to one, it's been used as an opportunity to regroup, right? When they're in a position of weakness, and to figure out future plans for future offensives. So I guess on the government, I imagine people in government areas are asking this question, like, why should we make peace with these people? What's the conversation around that?
There is no trust. There is absolutely no trust of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. I don't think the government officials and the people are operating on that. I think that they are holding down their military defense positions all over Tigray. They're watching closely as to how the TPLF combatants move and how the leadership actually follows through with this deal. I don't think any of this is really relying on the TPLF. It's possible that we'll have a couple of more windy moments before there is actual peace. And then even after that, I mean, think about it. 2 years, for 2 years, the TPLF told the people of Tigray that this is about genocide and they're going to wipe you out. And so what you have left behind, whoever was not killed in this war, are armed people, possibly armed young people that have been in this space of adrenaline for 2 years. So it's going to be really difficult to convince them to now, even from their own leadership. In fact, they might be outraged by the fact that the very same leadership that was telling them that this was about genocide and they needed to keep fighting and dying as they saw their friends and comrades die is now telling them they have to disarm. I don't know that it's going to go that smoothly, but my understanding is there's not that many combatants in the large scheme of things, so it can be handled. And then the other thing that I worry about is the extremism that 2 years of war is going to instill in any human. And if that extremism isn't the biggest issue, then how do you get these people to go back to normal life? I mean, we see the issue with veterans coming back home to the United States after fighting wars. They go into depression because the lifestyle is so different. I mean, something in you creates defense mechanisms to be able to deal with the war front, and then you come back home to just a regular life. And many of them go into depression, and we know the suicide rate is high among veterans. Part of that being the healthcare system is not good. But if the healthcare system is not good, it's way worse in Ethiopia, particularly when you're talking about psychological help. Although there's a more community-oriented culture, and that can help, but we really need professionals to be able to help these people go back into normal life. So those are the things that concern me most. And, whether or not the TPLF continues to work against the country, and they will. And by the way, this is worth noting, they will be delisted from the terrorist organization list by the Ethiopian parliament if they follow through with these negotiation deals. They'll be disarmed. If they're disarmed, as much as it bothers people in the country that have seen them be absolutely brutal and vicious for 20 plus years, and some would argue for 50 years since their inception in 1975, if they don't have guns, it's manageable. So if they see through that part of their bargain, I think the concession to have them be a part of the political sphere and let people let the people of Tigray and others decide, do we want to do this again? Do you want to really bet on this ideological group? Because it didn't work out this last time, and it just doesn't make sense to bet on them. But people might still bet on them anyway. And so that will be a challenge, but at least it will be a political challenge and not an armed challenge. So it remains to be seen, but absolutely no trust. I could see them going back on every piece of it, but the Ethiopian government is aware of exactly who they are. So I don't think they're leaving anything to chance.
You know, Hermela, this is a little bit of a broader question, but, you know, it's something we were on your show on I Have African News yesterday that someone pointed out. They said, they asked me, what did I make of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's expression of gratitude, not thanking the United States, but only thanking the African Union, former President Kenyatta of Kenya, the others of the High Representatives team, and also from South Africa. And it does raise, I think, an interesting question of a lot of people around the future of Ethiopia, because I think so much of what we have seen, the whole conflict, you know, until 2 days ago, basically, the U.S. was backing the TPLF. Now, of course, you know, everyone likes a winner, so the U.S. claims that they love what's happening now. But we know that some of the things around, you know, the national sovereignty of Ethiopia, from the Gerd Dam to the tripartite alliance with Eritrea and Somalia, the sanctions that were leveled, sanctions by another name, by removing the Ethiopia from AGOA. You know, a lot of people I know, at least, and I know that you know, in Ethiopia on the ground, felt like that this was also an important moment for the country to recognize that there is, you know, you can't count on the West either, and that really this was an inflection point for the country to start to, you know, really raise itself up, but also explore more cooperation on the South-South and an African continental level. So I guess I just wonder, from your perspective, you know, how important is that? Like, what lessons are important to draw about sovereignty, self-determination, poverty alleviation, and independence, you know, from this continent that should be taken forward, you know, in Ethiopia as the future becomes plotted?
I think what we've learned as a broad community, Ethiopians, Eritreans, allies, anti-war folks, what we've learned is you need to stay together, get real clear about what the truth is, and stay unified through all these different attacks that come from outside forces, the U.S. State Department efforts, think tanks, internally in Ethiopia. And that is really what makes the difference. I mean, today is the second year anniversary of the war. The Ethiopian National Defense Forces and all allied forces that literally gave up their lives so that we can even talk about this peace deal is what made the difference. Each time, you know, the Ethiopian government gave some concessions to the U.S., it ended up damaging things on the ground. So there's probably a reason why Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed did not mention the U.S. And even now, you guys, even now, the statements from the State Department intentionally only use the word cessation of hostilities. I don't even know if they use permanent. I could be wrong, but they only use they don't use the main word, which is disarmament. And so it's like they're distancing themselves from the very thing that would actually create peace. It looks like they're giving themselves room for the TPLF to continue to stay armed and go on the offensive. And then they can say, wait, was there disarmament? Because we've never mentioned disarmament. And so even just putting out a statement like that is undermining the peace process by simply calling it a cessation of hostilities instead of at least permanent cessation of hostilities and end to this war. We've had two rounds of cessation of hostilities since this war started back in June 2021 and then April 2022. Each of them were broken by the TPLF. So a cessation of hostilities is insufficient and unacceptable to the Ethiopian people and their neighbors in Eritrea. So they're doubling down, they're tripling down, and I think it's giving clarity to many Ethiopians who maybe, just maybe, thought, oh, we can get them on their side. Maybe, you know, politicians one by one with the work that AIPAC is doing, maybe you can eventually make them allies, but that's also a long game. It's not going to happen overnight.
But, you know, I don't want our listeners to be confused there about who is defending Ethiopia in Congress.
Yes, AEPACT.org, AIPACT.org. Good catch.
Well, I actually have one last thing that I kind of want to put to both of you, just to like zoom out a little bit, is what does this mean for the region? Like, what does this mean for the Horn of Africa? What does it mean for Eritrea and Somalia if this conflict actually does wind down? I don't know which one of you wants to. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, right. I forgot this was like we were trying something new. I mean, I'll answer, and I'm curious to hear because Eugene always has layers that I don't have. But I think it's huge. I think it means the IDPs, internally displaced, that have been living essentially on the streets in these on the ground, sleeping on the ground for the last 2 years, can maybe go back home, can have a sense of security. Some rehabilitation can happen for the people that's been affected by the war. For those in Tigray, they're also going to have a lot to contend with when they realize the war is over and their kids are not coming back. My guess is that as long as this war was going, and they didn't hear otherwise, there was reason to hope that the people from their families that were sent off to war would come back. But now that's going to become more clear, and the devastation that's going to sit in from that. So there's a lot of reconciliation and healing to do, and it was only possible with the TPLF out of the picture, or at least not in control with their guns in many parts of Tigray and neighboring Amhara and Afar regions. So it's a lot of rehabilitation, reconciliation, cleaning up the corruption that has also increased during this time of conflict, as it often does, and being able to focus on other security issues outside of this war, being able to focus on education, the healthcare system, agricultural development. These are things that we haven't been able to talk enough about because everything has centered around the war. But I will give credit to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. He's managed to multitask in that sense. I mean, what it looks like to me as time goes on is he leaves the military front to the military, with the exception of last November when it looked like there was some internal sabotage because it couldn't be explained why the TPLF combatants got all the way to Death Day where they did. He went to the military front. I think part of that was for morale of the country, and then the other part was just to make sure there wasn't any internal sabotage, because remember, this government is an offshoot of the 27-year TPLF-led government. And so the TPLF can pay people off. They've got loyalists that have benefited from their regime still in government. I don't know how many. So, but now it looks like some of that may have been cleaned up. So he's just focusing on other things and let the experts in their particular fields do what they need to do, which is, I think, a great management skill, and probably one that was really difficult to do in the beginning when you don't know how corrupted your government has gotten and how many of them are actually working with the insurgents that are trying to take over the country. So a lot of things we can talk about. It's a country of 120 million, a region of about 140, the Horn of Africa. We've got a lot of work to do. And I hope having some sense of peace will allow the country to move forward in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all very well taken points, and I think that's right? I mean, the impact of peace in the region is huge. I mean, you think about a country like Eritrea that since 1998, because of the efforts of the TPLF, living in essentially a permanent war situation, and as I think people there, the government there have pointed out, that's had a tremendous negative impact on the nature of the country and the type of policies they've had to pursue, and even just having a government in the TPLF in Ethiopia that was working with the United States to isolate the country. The idea of, not only a historic sort of cultural element to this of Ethiopia and Eritrea coming together and signing a peace deal and having huge cultural intercourse over the past couple of years, but economically, obviously, it will be huge purely just by reducing the potential war danger. But also, I mean, there's natural complementarity between all these countries in the Horn of Africa. I mean, that's the basis of the tripartite alliance in the first place. It's certainly the essence of Pan-Africanism all across Africa as a concept. I mean, you think about South Sudan, you think about the southern parts of Sudan, Blue Nile State, places like that. I mean, the most natural way for the farmers there and others, who could be forming more production using clean energy from the Gerd Dam, the easiest way to get their goods to the world market, right, is to go through Ethiopia, through Eritrea, and out through Massawa and Assab, right? So right there, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, collaborating can be something that potentially could lift up all of the people, which I think is an important element because it's, I think, crucial for us to remember, and I constantly remind people of this because it's relevant. the entire thing that really removed the TPLF from the scene was the huge anger in huge parts of the country about the way the wealth that was being created was being funneled off to just a tiny clique of elites, and there was mass unemployment and poverty, and this is what led to the huge protests in 2014. This is exactly why Abiy Ahmed rose as a figure, because he was seen to be someone who understood the needs and the desires of the unemployed young people, especially, to change their lives. So that kind of agenda, I think a poverty reduction, poverty alleviation, empowerment agenda for people in rural areas and the urban areas is all very much on the table there. Food sovereignty is obviously huge. Ethiopia and Eritrea both talking a lot about that. And I think we're talking about wheat. We had Rutendo from Zimbabwe talking about the huge wheat crop. So the possibility of African food sovereignty advancing, I think, is an important piece on so many different levels. So yeah, we could go on, but as I said at the very beginning of this conflict, as many people will remember, the U.S. policy has been pretty consistent in the Horn, and that's to keep them divided, because the weakness is exactly what keeps this whole region broadly impoverished, as long as everyone's just fighting and it's a handful of essentially warlords, taking the spoils, in their various little enclaves. So I think that it's a potentially very hopeful moment, just like I think the moment was in 2018 when these countries started coming together around this idea of a new Horn of Africa, and I think it's going to be interesting, Rania.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a campaign. There's a campaign going around that says "Trade, not aid." It was started before some months back, and it's coming back again. I mean, the U.S. loves to say, "We give you guys this much aid," and it's like, we don't want it. I mean, it actually, from what I understand, the last batch was sort of forced on the country, which there's suspicions they're coming in to do that, and they're gathering intel. Who knows what else they're doing? I mean, so many things that the Ethiopian and Eritrean people have suspected to be true have turned out to be true, especially when it comes to the West interference in there. So, like the Prime Minister recently said, I mean, aid is like, you can get addicted to aid. We want to learn how to fish. We do not want to be fed the fish. And that's something he's continued to say, which is so outrageous to some of the folks in the West. I remember, I don't know if it was Senator Coons from Delaware or one of the people in Congress, he was so angry about some of the developments in Ethiopia coming out of the prime minister's speeches. And one of the things he's just so outraged about was he said he doesn't need aid anymore. And it's like, what? Why are you so mad? So there's so many resources in Ethiopia. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is allowing the country to actually have hydropower agreements and sell hydropower. And we know water is the future, energy is the future. So there's so many opportunities for economic collaboration. There's some privatization, limited privatization going on in the country. So that will bring in some much needed dollars. I don't know to what extent they're controlling that, but there is so many ways to work with Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa if that was what the United States was interested in doing. But over time, just like the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the U.S. foreign policy gets more obvious and obvious and obvious that it is really just about control. They do not want to share the power and share the resources, which is something that the Horn of Africa is willing to do, but they want to maintain their sovereignty. And that's not something that they're able to do right now while working with the West. And a figure or a proxy like a TPLF would allow them, would just literally hand them control. As long as they were able to dominate the region and amass wealth, they didn't care that the U.S. was in control. But this government is trying to do right by the majority of the people who do live in poverty and just need some basic needs met. And that's going to happen at a faster rate. It's already happening now, but it's going to happen at a faster rate once we have peace in the North.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hermela, before I let you go, where can people find all of your work?
You can go to eoanews.com for all news out of Africa from the perspective of the African people. And you can also watch the live interviews on youtube.com/Hermela TV. Both places give you the option to contribute, to support independent journalism, and definitely contribute to Breakthrough News as well, because we're great partners and we share a lot of the same audience. They love you guys, and I appreciate you too.
Well, we appreciate you, Hermela Aregawi, Eye on Africa News. Thank you so much for joining us here on Breakthrough News. What'd I say?
Eyes.
There's an S on that. Because, France 24 has a bootleg eye on Africa. It really is bootleg. Like for all the resources, they didn't even try on the logo. But mine's trademarked and it's eyes on Africa.
Okay, excuse me. I would never want anyone to confuse you with France 24. So,
Never heard of it, so they're not doing all that good.
Eyes on Africa, EOA. Let's just go with that. Either way, it's all great, however you find it. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks, guys.
Well,
yeah,
Eugene.
Rania, I thought you were going to comment on my French. As a Lebanese person, aren't you an authority on
how I feel about French. You know how I feel about the language. I'm not a fan.
Yes, you love it.
No offense to all our French. No offense to all of our French audience. It's just, the whole France and Lebanon thing really off-putting.
Yeah. Today in the French National Assembly, a black guy who's in the French National Assembly was speaking, and some racist, another MP, yelled out, "Go back to Africa."
Wow.
Yeah, in the Parliament of France. The Parliament shut down. It was a huge kerfuffle.
Wild. But, France did colonize parts of Africa.
Well, the worst part is the guy was trying to clarify and be like, "Oh, no. I wasn't saying that about him. I was saying it about the immigrants coming to France from Africa.
Other Africans should go back. Yeah, that makes it okay.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Not a good statement. Not a good statement.
Amazing. Really amazing. But I wish I could remember his name. I know he's with the NUPS party. But yeah, he said no way was his response. But nevertheless, we are going to keep moving forward. We'll actually stay on the issue of race relations, if you will. We want to talk about the ongoing issues regarding affirmative action in the United States, which is under fire, under the gun, under attack in front of the Supreme Court. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Dr. Ben Becker. So he has big knowledge of higher education here. Dr. Ben Becker, editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Ben, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we were actually talking about this earlier. It feels like this is almost kind of flying under the radar a little bit, that almost all affirmative action in higher education could be ended in America. So maybe before we get into some of the implications, just maybe capsule view of who's arguing what in front of the Supreme Court, and when will they rule?
Yeah, well, the ruling should probably come in the next 6 months. Late spring, early summer is usually when the rulings begin. So this is going to have a big impact as soon as next year. But the gist of it is basically that conservative groups are suing the University of North Carolina as well as Harvard for having admissions policies that allow for the consideration of race among other factors in admitting students into their universities. And so it's really the culmination, you could say, of a decades-long effort by conservative legal strategists and conservative groups to claim that affirmative action policies, which were created in the late 60s and early 70s, are essentially racist against white people, that they are anti-white and discriminatory, and are actually utilizing the landmark civil rights cases that were used to deal with the legacies and realities of anti-Black racism, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Reconstruction Amendments, which struck down the mass civil rights violations of millions of Black people in the South. They're using those legal precedents to say that now it's white people who are essentially oppressed by these race-conscious admissions. So if the Supreme Court justices, the conservative supermajority, rules as is expected and as they've sort of established in the tenor of their questioning over the last few days, or especially on Halloween when they spent 5 hours discussing this, it is expected. Of course, things could change depending on the level of struggle, but it's expected that race-conscious admissions, just even the consideration of race in understanding an applicant, will be ruled unconstitutional, which will undoubtedly lead to mass diminution, a decline in Black and Latino college acceptance rates, especially at the very selective universities.
Well, it's quite shocking that this is even still an issue in 2022, but here we are. And I just want to play devil's advocate for a second, because you'll still hear people, and even liberals will say this sometimes, is like, why at this point do we even still need affirmative action? Like, what's that about? Isn't it just like, shouldn't it be about just class or just merit? And I know it sounds silly to ask you to respond to that, but can you respond to that? Because it's a pretty typical, it's a pretty typical argument you'll hear from like your average American.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's parts of it that is a good faith question and part of it is a bad faith question. And unfortunately, they get tangled up. And of course, we want to, like I went to Columbia University where there were all these bourgeois white students talking about, well, it should really be based on class, not race. And it's like, okay, so you're ready to be replaced then by poor white students? I wish someone could actually call their bluff on it, because I think it's purely a rhetorical device to basically destroy race-conscious affirmative action for a lot of people. It's not actually there's no class project or class agenda to really overturn the centuries of bourgeois education and take these elite universities and deliver them in the hands of the working class, if only. So that's one half of it. I think the other half, though, the question about how to do it in a race neutral way, how to really go after a class-based affirmative action, it hasn't really been proven that there's a way to do that that actually leads to large numbers of Black students still going to these universities. And when they've eliminated race considerations and they've said, oh, we're actually going to have class considerations and so forth, the reality is that the percentage of Black and Latino students goes way, way down. And I think what I would advocate for is an affirmative action policy that takes into account both race and class. And this idea to sort of pit them against each other is actually sort of the road to basically the destruction of affirmative action altogether. There are ways in which affirmative action has been hollowed out, has been sort of made a joke, and they've actually been sort of manipulated by elite ways, where you're basically only recruiting bourgeois and upper class students from these same communities of color. So that's obviously a problem, but the answer to that problem is not to eliminate all affirmative action. It's actually to make sure that you're targeting who it is you do want to recruit into these universities. So the real question is, like, why is it even necessary still? It's quite simple. I mean, the percentage of high school graduates who are Black and Latino is probably over 30% in the country. And when you look at, all the elite universities, it's starting to change a little bit in some cases, but again, we have to actually dig into the statistics. Or you look at the elite institutions that govern all the things in our lives, the corporations, the school systems, all of it, they're still overwhelmingly white and from the same bourgeois white class. So the question is, like, are we okay with 14% of high school graduates being Black and then being 1 or 2% of college graduates? And if you're not okay with that, then there has to be a policy to remedy that. And that's where affirmative action comes from. It doesn't come from actually the desire for diversity. This is unfortunately a way in which affirmative action has been sort of whittled down and weakened. Affirmative action comes from the desire to remedy a past harm. That's really the movement for it. Where does it come from? It's saying, well, look, the country was reckoning with centuries of slavery and Jim Crow. And the question is, how do we overcome that problem in the 1960s and 1970s? You had people in rebellion. You had the civil rights movement, mass civil disobedience. People were demanding inclusion, not from the standpoint of, oh, I just want to be near white people, but they wanted equality and they wanted equal access to the finest institutions. And the whole way of framing it around diversity, obviously I'm for diversity too, but that even sort of changes the conversation to be about, the benefits basically of white students to be in proximity with Black and Latino students. But that's making it a benefit for white students. Really, the benefit that affirmative action is supposed to be for was for the communities that have been historically disenfranchised, recognizing, and this is the thing that nobody wants to hear and nobody wants to apparently argue in the Supreme Court, including, unfortunately, the pro-affirmative action side, is that for many decades, affirmative action was white in this country. And it was, of course, middle class and white overwhelmingly, but we had a middle class that was built that was overwhelmingly white in this country through housing policy and educational policy. So the question of who then got into college generations down the line, it was already stacked against Black students in particular. So that's what the affirmative action policies of the 1960s and 70s were trying to reverse, was the de facto affirmative action that had historically privileged middle class white people's entrance into these universities.
Well, I think it's such an important point because that accumulated legacy is so much of why there's essentially every class-based category, right? Like the worst parts of it are disproportionately black, and I think there's a statistic. Remind me of the statistic, but about black young people who are in like the highest income quintiles, their family, the top fifth. Also have the highest rate of, I guess, dropping out of that. I don't know the exact stat, but I think that speaks exactly to the point you're making about the accumulated, impact of this racism.
Yeah, so let's actually tease it out, because this is, for those who have the good faith argument, like we should just target based on income alone and not race. If you actually were to do that, let me explain to you why it would be insufficient. Because the top 20% of if you're a black person in the top 20% of income, meaning what your salary is, what your family salary is, your children have a 50-50 chance of remaining in the top 20%, and they have not 50, they have the same chance of remaining in the top 20% as they have of ending up in the bottom 20%, meaning downward social mobility is a big feature of the black community, even for those who do, for a moment, end up with a higher income. And for white families, it's very different. You have a 5 times greater likelihood of remaining in the top 20% than you do of falling to the bottom 20%. Now, why is that? That's because of intergenerational wealth in particular. That, for many white families, because many of them have a relative who has property, or they have parents who have property, they have inheritance. Inherited wealth is about $170,000 for your median white family, and $17,000 for your median black family. So a 10 times difference. So that means if you have an accident, a misfortune, you lose a job in the black community, you're basically unable to turn to any of these sort of safety net. There's no cushioning, there's no buffer in your family. And so you end up, your kids end up, if you have to relocate to a part of the city, and a lot of this has to do with geography and housing and the schools, your kids are going to end up going to, again, inferior schools. So that's how, just targeting based on income is not going to work, because there's this inherited generations and generations of how class has been constructed in this country, largely according to race, that a snapshot of one person's income at a particular moment does not capture. So if you want to reverse that kind of systematic white supremacy, which does exist, you have to build your calculations of race into it. Now, with that being said, the universities are doing something very slick, because they're using sort of purely phenotype to also get around this issue. And what I mean by that is they're increasingly recruiting students, usually from upper class or bourgeois backgrounds, from the Caribbean, from Africa, or a very slim sort of fraction of black students who went to white prep schools. And they're bringing them in, and a lot of these students can then pay full price. And a lot of these students are, meeting their diversity targets, but they're not actually changing the overall situation, which is in cities like Baltimore or DC, where you have thousands and thousands of working class black young people, men and women. They're still locked out of these universities, but the universities get to claim that they're 14% black or 15% black. So yeah, that's a problem. But the way you address that is by actually targeting the working class communities that you do want to recruit. It doesn't mean by erasing race altogether.
So Ben, back to the Supreme Court decision that's going to come down in, I think, something like 6 months. We do have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court that has made some horrendous decisions. It's likely that they're going to vote to abolish affirmative action. What will be the consequences of that?
Well, I think there's going to be the immediate consequences if that happens. And of course, we have to put an if in it, because although it's true that this Supreme Court has shown in the Dobbs decision that they are willing to basically overturn many precedents, and affirmative action has been ruled on as legitimate in both 1978 and in 2003 by the Supreme Court. So again, this would be overturning longstanding precedent, just as they did with Roe. Both of those decisions also whittled down affirmative action, and I think has led to liberals backing off from the historical justice of affirmative action and changing their arguments, as I said. So that's what also makes it, I'm a bit pessimistic, but you never know. tens and hundreds of thousands of people marching to defend the right of Black and Latino students to remedy past injustices and get into elite and other selective universities could change the equation. The immediate impact would be a big decline. In the UC system, the University of California system, in 1996, a right-wing constitutional proposition outlawed race-based considerations in university admissions. And there was a calamitous decline in the immediate years where you had something in UCLA like, 2% of the student body was Black by just 2 or 3 years later. And most of them were there as athletes. So basically they had totally excluded all the surrounding communities of Los Angeles and in California of working class Black students. So I think that in many cases you will see similar declines right away. With that being said, in the UC system, there has been a big struggle as a result of that, because California is a progressive state in general where people are fighting and said, this is unacceptable. This is racist. If you can't consider race, we're still going to find some other way. And so there were big campaigns to make sure that UCLA, for instance, aggressively recruit in Black communities in Los Angeles and the surrounding area. There have been big campaigns to eliminate standardized testing as a consideration. They say, oh, you're going to eliminate race? Okay, fine, we're going to eliminate standardized testing too. So there are ways that in which people, even in this new environment where race-based considerations are taken out, you can still fight for, for the inclusion of those who have been historically oppressed, those who have been historically excluded. So I think the immediate impact will be a big decline, but it also sets the stage for a big struggle. And to really revisit how it is that these universities are selecting students to begin with, because there's lots of backhanded ways in which they discriminate in favor of elite and white students, and we have to really address those too. It can't be just about yes, you should consider race. We have to talk about legacy students. Think about all the legacy students, which itself has a racial implication, where if your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents went to a university, you're therefore able to go. Like, why don't we ban that too? Or these letters of acceptance, where these bourgeois people who barely even know someone, they're basically calling in a family like favor and writing, like the mayor writes a letter of recommendation. Well, that student's going to get in. So it's all based on these connections. So
yeah, you mean
really
like Hunter Biden wrote the one for Tucker Carlson. They're all enemies on TV and friends behind the scenes.
Yep.
Wow, I did not know that. That is amazing. But yeah, but that's the whole thing. I mean, yeah, we should actually go at these universities and how they admit students, so that it won't be the end of the struggle, but it'll definitely be a big step backwards if they rule in this way.
Yeah, no, I very well taken point. I think, some of us remember Greta v. Bollinger in 2003. That was a very close run, and I very, very much believe that the huge mobilization played a big role in why the Supreme Court ruled the way they did. The Bush administration had to modify their position to some degree because of the mass struggle that was there. So a lot to be said, and you could see in the oral arguments, Gorsuch especially seemed to be kind of doing some trial balloons for some ways they could potentially rule against affirmative action, but maybe not as bad. So the fear, obviously, of the backlash to attacking, what is obviously a just mechanism is out there, but I think it does depend on, folks getting out.
Yeah, let me just leave your listeners with this, though. I mean, the whole, we have to really attack what the conservatives are saying right here. They're saying Brown versus Board of Education said that we should not consider racial classifications in, educational opportunities. So by us overthrowing affirmative action, we're fulfilling the spirit of Brown versus Board of Education.
Wow.
I mean, one set of racial classifications was set up to exclude people from a quality education. These racial classifications have been set up to include people. So this is it's a complete parody. It's a disgusting inversion of what the Black freedom movement fought for so many years. And then to cynically say, well, therefore, we're going to use the same exact legal precedents and try to turn this against the Black freedom movement and say that it's no longer necessary. And this whole idea that we're going to be race blind in college admissions. But what other institution is race blind? Is a landlord race blind? Is a police officer race blind? I mean, all these other things are, it's not race blind in America, unfortunately. So many outcomes are determined based on race. But the moment we want to do something positive for people based on race, well, now we have to be race blind. It's disgusting, and we should really, I think people have to be angry about it. I will say one other hopeful point, so do not be completely pessimistic. When people hear the question, do you think affirmative action policies should increase the share of Black and Latino students in selective universities? 37% of people say yes, 30% say no, and about 30% don't know, and 35% say no. So a slim majority is in favor of affirmative action policies when framed in this way. Should we increase the share of Black and Latino students in selective universities? But then when they ask the same question, they say, should we decrease the share of white and Asian students to make room for others? Then the number changes. So it's really about how the question is asked, how the information is presented. Only 19% defend affirmative action when it's posed in the context of, should we take away educational opportunities for white and Asian people? So that's what the right wing is trying to do. We have to call that out, and we have to demand more education for everybody. We have to also demand that, because obviously they've set this up as a zero-sum game, as I think Justice Alito said the other day. It's a zero-sum game. Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game if you vastly expand educational opportunities in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that point about reparations is key. It was a zero-sum game for a lot of people for a long time. So, maybe others just got to get used to it. But anyway, I'll leave it on that note. Dr. Ben Becker, editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, Baltimore native, thank you for joining us.
Well,
yep,
that was another great show.
Thank you, Rania. I appreciate that. That is your affirmation is what we always look for. Here you are, the professional, our leader. But yes, bringing us to the end of the show yet again. Bittersweet time, of course, for Rania and I, not only interacting with each other, but interacting with you, our dear viewers. But I will remind you, you can see lots of us if you just hit the subscribe button there on YouTube and hit the bell so you get the alerts. And of course, if you want to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news and become an ongoing donor. Big shout out to everybody who donated here in the YouTube chat today. Thanks to everyone for watching, and we will be back with you next week.
Yeah.